Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of MEMO's weekly review show with me, Nasim Ahmed. I am joined by our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you, Nasim.
Yeah, we've got a packed show today. We'll be discussing a new bill that's being discussed in the US Congress, seeking, of all things, to punish South Africa for bringing a genocide case against Israel in the ICJ, which is quite a shocking development. The latest on the suspension of UNRWA and Israel's dodgy dossier is looking more and more like a dodgy dossier about the UNRWA staff who are alleged to have been part of the October 7 attack. We'll be looking at the region. A new poll finds that 94% of people in the region now believe that the US is the greatest threat to regional stability because of its support for Israel. Who would have thought that? We'll also discuss Saudi push for a regional Arab effort to apply pressure on Israel. What does that mean? Is that even possible? And we'll be asking efforts to criminalize anti-Zionism in the West has suffered a blow following a landmark legal case here in the UK. But let's begin with the latest development from Gaza over the past week. We've seen a number of organizations issue warnings of the starvation in Gaza. Rafah has become, place for destitute Palestinians. Nearly 1.5 million Palestinians are in Rafah, and the UN has warned of imminent famine and catastrophe. And in the middle of all this catastrophe, Benjamin Netanyahu has demanded that 1.5 million or so of the Palestinians who are in Rafah be evacuated. That is so he can continue with the bombardment and a military escalation in the Rafah crossing area. So that's quite a shocking development. There's been a lot of condemnation of that, Moin. So what do you make of this phase in Israel's military operation? Given, Palestinians have nowhere to go. If I could share something, I remember at the beginning of this conflict, many of our viewers will know someone called Piers Morgan. In October, he said something along the line of, if Israel goes south of Gaza, I will change my mind. He was very staunch pro-Israeli right at the beginning of the war, and he said to his audience, "Look, if Israel goes south, then I will change my mind and I'll believe what the pro-Palestinians are saying about Israel, that Israel is genocidal, is seeking to ethnically cleanse Palestinians." And now we see they're not seeking to go south of Gaza, they're seeking to expel Palestinians from Rafah itself. So that's quite a shocking development. What do you make of this phase in Israel's military operation?
Well, first of all, regarding your point about starvation, yes, there is starvation in the Gaza Strip, but in the northern Gaza Strip, there are now multiple reports that it has reached the level of an actual famine, a man-made Israeli engineered famine, but famine all the same. In the rest of the Gaza Strip, there is, of course, increasing hunger and starvation, lack of access to clean water, lack of access to medicines and medical supplies, the severe shortage of fuel and electricity and so on, which has all kinds of indirect compound effects, on the ability of hospitals to operate, on the ability to treat raw sewage. And this has led to an explosion of communicable diseases, such as hepatitis, and which is all having a particularly severe effect on children. Regarding Rafah, to some extent, this may be a threat by the Israeli government in order to pressure Hamas to accept its terms for a temporary ceasefire and exchange of captives. But at the same time, I think the Americans have essentially told the Israelis that they want any military operation in Rafah to be concluded before the beginning of the Islamic fasting month of Ramadan, which is around the 9th or the 10th of March. And the Americans are very worried that if this offensive continues at the current level of intensity during that period, that it could lead to heightened regional repercussions, not only against Israel, but also against the United States, given that the United States is, for all intents and purposes, a co-belligerent in this genocidal onslaught against the Gaza Strip. Rafah is the remaining Palestinian city which Israeli forces have thus far not entered. As you noted, it is also the area where something over 1.5 million Palestinians have relocated to from other parts of the Gaza Strip on the basis of a combination of evacuation orders, forced displacements, and terror bombings that have led them to leave. And I think what the Israelis are hoping to do is to essentially expel these people to the desert, to the Sinai Peninsula, drive them into the sea if necessary. But there's two issues here. First of all, is that this abuts the Egyptian border, and the Egyptians are making increasingly loud noises that if Israel proceeds with this offensive, and particularly if it leads to a rupture of the Palestinian-Egyptian border, that Israel will be playing with fire, and that Egypt may, under those circumstances, suspend its 1979 peace treaty with Israel, which has been foundational to Israeli security and Israel's ability to have its way with the Palestinians for close to half a century now. It's an open question of how seriously we should take these Egyptian warnings, but it's a significant development nonetheless. Second of all, any Israeli incursion into Rafah is going to lead to a massive increase in the number of Palestinian civilian casualties. We're already seeing that with the intensification of bombings and air raids on Rafah, because its population has increased to by a 1.5 million souls in recent months on account of the Israeli military onslaught on the northern and central Gaza Strip. Now, the obvious thing to do, of course, is if you want these people to evacuate, first of all, you provide them safe passage. Second of all, you provide them safe passage to your own territory, which also happens to be their original homes, not to a foreign country. But of course, Israel's broader strategic objective is to depopulate the Gaza Strip, and failing that, to make the Gaza Strip unfit for human habitation, and in certain respects to make it unfit for human life with its terror bombings of these refugees that are now concentrated in Rafah.
You mentioned the US and Washington wanting to wind this down before Ramadan. And it seems to me that there seems to be a widening of gap in the position between the US and what Netanyahu is saying. If US on the one hand is calling for, as I said, winding down for Ramadan, but Netanyahu has insisted that he will have nothing but absolute victory. That's what he said over the week, and that's within the context of a ceasefire. The Americans have, Tel Aviv, Netanyahu has basically rejected any talk of a ceasefire. So the question, I guess, is, and we also saw, I would say, Blinken being humiliated somewhat. I mean, he cancelled his trip to the Rafah crossing, partly, I would say, because of the optics. There's ongoing protests there, Israelis protesting against humanitarian aid being delivered to the Palestinians, and that makes for all kinds of horrible images for an American secretary to be there at that moment. And as I said, Netanyahu rejected the ceasefire. So are we seeing a widening of the gap between the US's position and that of Israel, at least as far as the way the war is being conducted? Americans want some kind of end. I don't know what that looks like. And the Israelis want full victory, as Netanyahu, absolute victory, as Netanyahu has said.
Are we seeing a growing gap between the United States and Israel? Yes and no. At the level of formal statements, the US is expressing preferences and objectives that are increasingly divergent from those that are being put forward by the Israeli leadership, and specifically by Prime Minister Netanyahu. But words are cheap. The United States has continuously expressed policy preferences, sentiments, positions that differ from those of Israel, but in the end has done nothing to use its very, very, very considerable, decisive leverage and influence over Israel to compel a change in Israeli conduct. To the contrary, um, one reason that we've seen this growing gap is because the Israeli leadership, and particularly Netanyahu, have full confidence that they can flout US policy preferences with full impunity, because the US is continuing to unconditionally support Israel militarily and politically and diplomatically. All this talk coming out of Washington, I think, only deserves to be taken seriously if the positions that are being expressed by Washington are also positions Washington is prepared to promote by, for example, withholding a veto at the UN Security Council, by, for example, reducing, restricting, or ending its supply of weapons that effectively makes it a co-belligerent in the genocide against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. You know, when a superpower says things that are in many respects the opposite of what its client state says it is doing, and then does absolutely nothing to change the behavior of its client state, I think it's fair to say that these words are intended primarily for public consumption, that they are to a great extent a diversionary charade, and that we can safely ignore them. And there's really no need to sit here and discuss and analyze them absent any meaningful action by the superpower to ensure that the client state falls into line.
And in the middle of this catastrophe, the hunger and the famine that's Palestinians are suffering, we've seen funding cuts on UNRWA, and the latest on that is that 2 weeks on, there's still no conclusive evidence provided by Israel. UK Channel 4 did a fantastic report last week, asked by the UK in particular, cut funding and believed Israel's dodgy dossier on the basis of flimsy evidence. And 2 weeks on, there doesn't seem to be any evidence. So the question is it looking increasingly likely that the UK, US, and other Western allies have fallen for Israel's dodgy dossier and now looking for a way to resume funding without losing face completely? Because there have been a number of statements issued over the week from Washington saying that we want the investigation to continue before we resume. But it seems like while this humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding, how can you continue to defund UNRWA at such a critical moment in time?
Well, I think it's I wouldn't agree with the assumption that the US and the Europeans were fooled by Israel into suspending their funding of UNRWA. They knew much better than you and I knew at the time that they were provided no evidence, that they were merely given allegations. They hid behind the decision of the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Lazzarini, to summarily dismiss these 12 employees prior to the beginning of any investigation. And the reason that UNRWA did so was to demonstrate to its funders that it was taking these allegations very seriously, precisely to prevent a suspension of funding for UNRWA at this time of extremely dire need. what UNRWA's funders did instead is they used this very ill-advised, I should add, attempted preventive measures by UNRWA as justification to do exactly what they would have done anyway, which is to punish the Palestinians for the ruling of the International Court of Justice that it is plausible that Israel is committing genocide and that it needs to take certain measures to stop. You know, the principle that international law applies equally to the West and to Israel is something that's simply unacceptable to these countries. They effectively took major policy decisions in the middle of a genocide based on allegations for which no evidence was provided, and in certain respects to press reports. I mean, the United Nations itself has said it has not yet received any evidence. The Canadian government has said it has not received any evidence. Blinken, you know, typically the clueless airhead, said that the U.S. had not received any evidence, but that it considers the Israeli allegations very, very credible, in his words. Well, what else do you expect? He, like his boss Biden, are ideologically invested in Israel and in Israel's campaign against the Gaza Strip. To them, this genocide is a good thing that must succeed because to them, Palestinians are irrelevant human scum. At the same time, a number of these governments that announced a suspension of funding to UNRWA had already transferred their commitments to UNRWA for the current fiscal year to the agency. And so therefore, this suspension would not have any financial impact for another 6 or 12 months. But nevertheless, I mean, I think the symbolism in the middle of a genocide, after the International Court of Justice has ruled that there can be no efforts to reduce urgently needed life-saving humanitarian supplies to the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. You know, it's collective punishment. These governments knew exactly what they're doing. And basically, you want international law? Enjoy your famine.
Now, ICJ will be requiring Israel to report back in a few weeks' time on the case, a genocide case. The ICJ is also, the International Court of Justice, is also holding a public hearing in just over a week's time. I know it's a while away, but I want to get your thoughts on that and get our viewers to, you know, be aware that there is another ICJ case ongoing with regards to Israel. And the hearing is for a determination on the legal consequences arising from Israel's occupation of the occupied West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem.
Yes.
So what is this hearing about, and what should our viewers be looking out for? Because this is
Yes.
not the ICJ case on genocide. This is something completely different. What should they be looking out for?
It is completely different. The case we've just been discussing, the genocide case, was brought by one state, South Africa, against another, Israel, for violating a treaty to which both are parties, a 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This case was not brought by a state against Israel. This case originated in the General Assembly of the United Nations, which last year, as it has done on multiple occasions with respect to multiple questions over the years, has requested the ICJ to give what is called an advisory opinion on a subject deemed sufficiently important that the World Court has been asked to rule on it. And in this case, the question before the ICJ is basically asking the ICJ to determine the status of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza Strip. Are these legitimately occupied territories in the sense that military occupation, whatever one may think of it, is a recognized status under international law. Military occupation in and of itself is not illegitimate or illegal. The policies that are conducted in such an occupation may be illegitimate and illegal, but the occupation in and of itself is a recognized status under international law. The argument being made by the Palestinians and by many other states who will each be given a half hour to present their arguments to the court, beginning, I believe, on the 16th or the 19th of this month, is that the nature of Israeli rule in these territories transcends military occupation and is effectively one of annexation, which is illegitimate and illegal under international law. And therefore, if the court agrees with this argument, that would make Israel's very presence, its continued rule in any form in these territories, illegal, similar to what the court, for example, decided with respect to South African rule in Namibia in 1970. Should this case succeed, it would essentially upend the peace process industry, because if Israel's presence in these territories is illegal, well, then the only thing left for Israel to do is to get out. And this whole idea that you need to have several decades of negotiations to determine if Israel needs to leave, how much territory Israel should relinquish, and under what conditions becomes entirely irrelevant, because it will have no right of presence in these territories. So this is a case that is at least as important, I would argue, politically speaking, as a genocide case. But just as with the genocide case, and just as with the Namibia case that I mentioned earlier, it is not self-implementing. It cannot be enforced by the court itself, nor can it be enforced by the General Assembly, which requested this advisory opinion. It can only be enforced by the Security Council. And, given that Israel's patron saint, the United States, is a permanent veto-wielding member of the Security Council, that's not going to happen either. And so therefore, ultimately, it will be the efforts of Palestinians and their allies on the ground and internationally that will change reality rather than a court ruling. But it would be a very important ruling nonetheless.
That's a story we'll be following, and I'm sure we'll be bringing more analysis from you and from MEMO on this ongoing legal case. But let's turn our attention now to the region and some of the latest updates from there. There's been a new poll that was carried out in the Arab world, and you get these polls annually. And what's striking about this poll is the increase in the sheer number of Arabs in the Middle East who are really opposed to Israel and Biden's policy and the blank check that he's given to Israel. It's really damaged US his image, according to this poll. 94% of Arabs oppose Biden's Gaza policy, and more than half have said that US constitutes the biggest threat to peace and stability in the region. The poll also went on to show a notable increase of opposition in the Arab world in recognizing Israel, which of course is something which the Gulf states need to be taking consideration of, partly because Arab countries, the Gulf states, are trying to normalize relations with Israel, I mean. So what struck me more than anything is that in Saudi Arabia in particular, the opposition to Israel has jumped from 38% from last year to 68%, which should increase the pressure, you would think, on Mohammed bin Salman and his effort trying to normalize relation with Israel. What do you make of the poll's finding, and what are the things that stood out for you?
Well, Again, I mean, U.S. reputation, and that of Europe for that matter, has been declining in the Middle East and in the Arab world specifically for decades. You know, a key turning point, for example, was the illegal 2003 Anglo-American invasion, occupation, and destruction of Iraq. But I think that what we've been seeing in recent months is of a qualitatively different level. It's not just another Israeli attack on the Gaza Strip or another Arab-Israeli armed confrontation like we had in Lebanon in 2006 or Gaza in 2008, 12, 14, and on other instances. What we're talking about now is qualitatively and quantitatively entirely different. We're talking about genocide. That's number one. Number two, if you look at Iraq, okay, complete sham, but Bush and Blair at least went through the motions of pretending that they were doing this with a view to providing the people of Iraq and the region, and not only themselves or their friends in Israel, with a better future. What you have here is a Biden administration that is so thoroughly ideologically invested in Israel's genocidal campaign that it can't even go through the motions of pretending to have the least bit of empathy for more than 10,000 Palestinian children who have been slaughtered by their Israeli client and ally. Um, Absolutely incapable of showing the least concern for the systematic destruction of the Gaza Strip and the systematic destruction of its civilian infrastructure. Couldn't care less about the famine that they and their Israeli friends have jointly engineered, and so on. I mean, the partisanship is, even compared to previously notable pro-Israeli U.S. administrations. I can think, for example, of Reagan, Nixon, and others. This is on a whole different level. The sheer contempt shown not only for Palestinians but Arabs more generally, and really radiating this attitude that Palestinians are simply irrelevant human scum who need to be gotten out of the way. I think that has really affected people as much as Israel's actual genocidal actions. And to the extent that one can say that the US still had any influence over Arab public opinion, or that Europe had it, these, I believe, lie permanently buried under the rubble of the Gaza Strip. Now, with specific respect to Saudi Arabia, I can't say I'm entirely surprised. You know, when this question was asked last year, regardless of what Saudi respondents may have felt or believed, the question of Palestine was really nowhere to be found on the agenda. It wasn't a prominent news story. There had been media barrage about the prospects of Saudi-Israeli normalization and the U.S. benefits to Saudi Arabia that such an agreement might bring. And so I suspect many people took kind of a dispassionate or wait and see attitude. Now, of course, when you ask the same question in the midst of a genocide, um, um, attitudes and responses are going to be fundamentally different. And that is reflected in the poll. I think if there's anything about the poll that surprises me, it's that only 98% of Arabs consider the US the main threat to Arab national security.
Yeah, and one of the assumptions this basically debunks is the idea that Arab autocrats can simply ignore Arab public opinion. That's one of the major theories that's spread here in the West. But this goes to show that public opinion can have an impact even in authoritarian regimes and absolute monarchies like Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia last week announced that it's hosting a summit of foreign ministers from 5 countries in the region for an Arab response regarding Israel's genocide in Gaza. And then we also heard of from Turkey, President Erdogan. He said that his country is looking to diplomatic efforts and to have a common position against Israel of all the Islamic countries. So you see opposition not just on the streets, Arab public opinion, but also on a state level. It seems like they are responding to Arab public opinion on the ground. And I think it kind of debunks the idea that even authoritarian regimes can simply ignore their population. They can't ignore their population. They have to
Yes.
respond somehow.
Well, the conventional wisdom is that elected governments are responsive to the pressure of public opinion, and that autocracies and absolute monarchies and dictatorships are not. Well, look at what's happening. You have elected governments throughout Europe and in North America, where poll after poll after poll demonstrates that a clear majority of voters in those countries support a ceasefire and support an end to their government support of Israel's genocidal campaign, and it's had zero impact. The massive shipments of weapons to Israel are still coming from the United States. Germany is still using Gestapo tactics to try to stamp out any shows of support to Palestinian human rights, and so on and so forth. At the same time, when you look at these autocracies in the Arab world, yes, they are responsive to public opinion. And I think the reason they are responsive is because this issue lives so strongly among their citizens, and they know it. This is not just raising the VAT or something. This is an issue that, for all the efforts by the West and Israel to pretend that it doesn't matter anymore because no one in the region cares about it, this has been the central common regional concern of the Arab peoples since the 1940s. And I think this poll demonstrates that that is very much still the case. As for Mohammed bin Salman and Erdogan, I'm inclined to take their statements with a pinch of salt. They had an opportunity, I think it was in November, when there was a joint Arab League organization of Islamic Cooperation Summit in Riyadh, and they adopted these resolutions that they were going to immediately begin bringing humanitarian supplies into the Gaza Strip, and would not be deterred by either the Israeli siege or any other measures. Well, they've done absolutely nothing since then. And Egypt is still treating the Palestinian-Egyptian border as if it's under Israeli sovereignty. That's number one. Then they also took a decision that they would send a delegation composed of foreign ministers of some of the more prominent members of these two organizations to visit global capitals. And instead of getting on the first plane to Washington and reading the Riot Act to Blinken and Biden and Sullivan and Austin, they went first to Beijing. I think they then went to Delhi, then to Moscow, and then a few European capitals. And by the time they arrived in Washington, people had forgotten they were even on this mission. So I think on the one hand, they are responding to public opinion and public pressure, but at the same time, they're also not taking any significant measures in support of the Palestinians, because at the end of the day, in most cases, these are governments that live in terror of Washington and live in terror of earning Washington's disapproval, and that in many cases also see improved relations with Israel as the best mechanism through which to curry favor with their superpower patron in the White House.
One final story from the region from last week is Iraqi armed forces demanding the end of US mission in the country. And they said US attack was the last straw. Americans have to leave Iraq. Question a lot of people asking, why is US there in the first place? And do you think, US position in Iraq has become untenable? Can they keep their forces there any longer, given how this has escalated?
I think it has become untenable, and I think the US presence in Syria is also becoming untenable. Um, I should add that in Iraq, they're there by agreement with the Iraqi government. Their presence in Syria is illegal. They never asked or sought or negotiated permission with the government in Damascus to station forces on its sovereign soil. Regardless of what one thinks of the government in Damascus, it is a sovereign authority in Syria, not the United States. Those military bases are formally there as part of a mission to prevent the resurgence of ISIS. But I think many people in the region will say that preventing the resurgence of ISIS in Syria and Iraq is not really the main concern of these American military forces in the region. And what has happened is because they are there by agreement with Iraq and haven't seen any threat to their presence from the Syrian government, they're in a fairly vulnerable position, which hasn't really mattered until the last few months, when, as part of their efforts to support the Palestinians and try to exercise pressure on Israel and the United States to end the genocidal onslaught on the Gaza Strip, a number of militias based in Iraq and Syria began launching attacks against these military bases, showing just how vulnerable they are, and for that matter, also launching attacks on a U.S. base in eastern Jordan. Now, the U.S. has started responding to these attacks with assassinations of Iraqi militiamen and militia leaders. Now, also Iraqi civilians are being killed in these strikes, and the Iraqi government sees the continued U.S. presence as a threat to its internal stability, and therefore has essentially asked U.S. forces to pack up and go home.
Let's turn our attention to now a couple of stories from Washington and London. A bill has been submitted to the US Congress calling for a full review of the country's relationship with South Africa following ICJ's court ruling. From my understanding, the measure is clearly an attempt to punish South Africa. I don't know if people expected such a draconian response from the Biden administration. I mean, to me, it seems like such a Trumpian thing to do. Trump, as viewers may know, took a punitive measure against the International Criminal Court, not the ICJ, International Criminal Court, in 2020 by imposing sanctions on the chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, and other senior officials in the ICC for having the gall to open investigation against the US and Israel. It's such a Trumpian move. I mean, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, it's quite an extraordinary thing for the Biden administration to even contemplate doing, sanctioning South Africa for taking a case to the ICJ.
It is, but if I'm not mistaken, it's actually worse than you present it, because this is not an initiative of the U.S. government, of the Biden White House. This is a bipartisan initiative emanating from the US Congress, calling, if I understood correctly, for a comprehensive review of US South African relations and making all kinds of spurious allegations against the African National Congress, the liberation movement that now forms leadership and government of South Africa. Again, it's the same principle. How dare you apply international law to us? Who do you Africans think you are, to hold Israel to the same standards under the Genocide Convention that we hold our enemies? But at the same time, you look at history, the US was famously in cahoots with the apartheid regime almost till the bitter end. Reagan, the US president during the 1980s, much like his close friend and ally, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, they both denounced Nelson Mandela as a terrorist and the ANC as a terrorist organization and a Soviet proxy and so on. So it stands to reason that a state that embraced apartheid in South Africa will also embrace it in Palestine.
And the next story is from London. I mean, it's a very local issue, but I think it has major implications for Europe, where we've seen strong support for Israel. I'm referring to a case of Professor David Miller. Just a bit of background, he's a British professor who sued the University of Bristol for unfair dismissal. Miller is a staunch anti-Zionist and claimed that he was dismissed because of his anti-Zionist views. A ruling was issued by an employment tribunal last week in his favor. The tribunal judged that anti-Zionist beliefs qualified as a protected belief, like one's belief in religion, one's own religious beliefs. So, I mean, to a lot of us, I mean, it seems nonsensical that this required a court judgment to confirm what is obvious to begin with. I mean, opposition to Zionism should be a legitimate exercise of one's free speech. Nevertheless, in this case, it took a landmark legal case to make that point. So we've seen this kind of witch hunt, not just in the UK, elsewhere as well, in Germany, France, throughout Europe, and of course in the US as well. So based on this, can you see a scenario where others across Europe begin to push back against efforts to criminalize anti-Zionist views?
Yeah, well, don't tell Keir Starmer. And also, it's my understanding that Bristol University is in the process of appealing this ruling. I don't know if I understood that correctly or not, but yes, it is a landmark ruling because despite the long-standing and ongoing efforts to demonize, to delegitimize criticism of Israel and opposition to Zionism, what has happened now, and I should add, many people have really suffered consequences for holding views that are not because they're opposed to the government of the United Kingdom, but because they're opposed to the government of Israel in the United Kingdom. People have suffered for this. People, journalists, academics, others have lost their jobs. There's been, and it's really intensified since October 7th, and has reached its height during Israel's genocidal onslaught against the Gaza Strip. I mean, I think to call them McCarthyite tactics is too kind, really, because they go way beyond that. We're almost getting into the realm here of things that we saw in Germany during the 1930s. Many people, quite understandably, are simply too terrified to speak their mind at the workplace, in a university, in other public spheres. And so, yes, I think this is a landmark ruling. And I think it also demonstrates that Israel's position among Western and particularly European public opinion is getting so precarious that they are increasingly resorting to the power of intimidation and of the courts to seek to silence people because they can no longer engage them in a free exchange of ideas in a debate and come out on top.
Thank you, Moin. That wraps up another episode of our weekly review. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. And thank you for tuning in, and see you all next week for another episode of Memo Review with me, Nasim Ahmed.